For 300 years, people thought they knew who was buried under Manhattan's African burial ground. Everyone believed one story, and nobody checked if it was true. The question was always what old papers said. Nobody stopped to ask what the bones said. Then a scientist named Fatimah Jackson took DNA from the remains in that ground. She expected it to show West Africa. Instead, she stopped and looked again. The DNA passed down from mothers, the kind that never changes, did not point to West Africa alone. She tested it again. She got the same answer, and it pointed somewhere no one expected. To understand why this mattered so much, we need to go back to where it all started, at a construction site in Lower Manhattan, with a worker who had no idea he was about to change history. It was the fall of 1991. The government was building a new office building on Broadway, just a few blocks from City Hall. They did not know what was buried underneath it. On the second day of digging, a worker's machine hit something no one expected 30 feet down. Then it happened again. By the end of the week, the workers had found bodies that were carefully placed and well preserved. They were clearly African. This turned out to be the oldest and largest African burial ground from colonial times ever found in North America. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people were buried there. Men, women, and children. Some born in Africa and brought across the ocean. Others born in the very colony they were forced to help build. The city had built right over them. For almost 200 years, hardly anyone in New York knew they were there. What came out of the ground in those weeks was more than bones and old objects. It was the first real proof that black people had lived in Manhattan from its very beginning, doing the work that built the city, and then being buried and forgotten. The descendants of those people, the black New Yorkers who came to the site once word got out, understood what they were looking at faster than the government agency in charge of the project did. These were their people. These were the ones nobody had ever written down. The community fought to control what happened next. The government agency wanted to keep building on schedule, treating the discovery like a problem instead of something sacred. So the community organized. Church leaders, historians, activists, and everyday New Yorkers pushed back so hard that it reached Congress. New laws were passed to stop construction on the most important parts of the site. And when it came time to decide who would study the remains scientifically, the community had one clear answer: Howard University, a historically black school. Black scholars would study the remains of black people who had been buried in a city that sometimes acted like they had never existed. The work that followed took years. Dr. Michael Blakey led the team at Howard's Montague Cobb Research Laboratory. Even before this discovery, he had spent years learning how to study human remains the right way, without repeating the harmful, careless methods that scientists had used in the past. When the community insisted that Howard do the work, he understood exactly what that meant. In a later interview, he described the moment his team first understood how big this discovery really was. He said he remembered standing at the edge of the site and realizing this was not just an archaeological find. This was a community. These were people who had been deliberately forgotten, and the city had built itself right on top of that forgetting. He said that thought stayed with him through every year of the work that followed. What they created became one of the most detailed scientific studies ever done on an enslaved population. They studied the chemistry in the bones, injuries, signs of disease, poor nutrition, and hard physical labor, all still visible in bones that were hundreds of years old. The bones told stories that the written records never bothered to keep. Children who had been forced to work so young that it left permanent marks on their skeletons. Women whose spines showed the kind of damage that comes from carrying heavy loads on their heads for years. This was a population that built a city and was worn down doing it. If this is the kind of history that never made it into your school books, the kind that got buried along with the people who lived it, remember this: there's always more history waiting to be found. The remains were finally returned to ground with full honors in 2003. They traveled through 6 cities in hand-carved wooden coffins made in Ghana, and thousands of people came out to honor ancestors they had never known. The site became a national monument. A visitor center was built. A memorial was put up. Most people thought that this was the end of the scientific story. It was not the end. It had barely started. Here is the part that most stories about the African burial ground leave out, and it matters more than almost anything that came before it. After the remains were reburied, scientists could no longer study them directly, but Howard's laboratory still had something else. Soil samples that had been collected at the same time as the remains, back during the original dig. And hidden inside that soil, quietly surviving for more than 300 years, was ancient DNA, not from the bones themselves, from the soil that had surrounded them. Fatimah Jackson is a biologist and anthropologist, a professor at Howard University, and the director of the Montague Cobb Research Laboratory, the same lab that had led the original study of the burial ground. She has spent decades studying the family history of African and African American people, finding ways to understand ancestry for groups of people whose written records were destroyed or never kept at all. In 2020, she shared new research describing what she and her team were finding in the ancient DNA pulled from that burial soil. What she said in that research, and in interviews afterward, stopped people in their tracks. Almost every story about the transatlantic slave trade assumes something about geography, that all came from West Africa, the coast of Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, the Congo, and Angola. These were the ports. These were the places where the ships loaded people. So the assumption followed naturally. The people buried in that ground must have come from West Africa, from the places the ships stopped. That was the story everyone had always been taught. Jackson was studying mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed only from mother to daughter, unchanged across generations. It's a direct line through time that nothing along the way can alter. And what she found in that soil was not what everyone expected. She said it plainly in a recorded interview. We are finding that the maternal family lines of African Americans come from all over Africa, from East Africa, from West Africa, from Central Africa. Most are from West and Central Africa, for sure, but also from Southern Africa, from Eastern Africa, and from North Africa. Take a moment to really think about that. The people buried 30 feet below a Manhattan construction site. The people who built the wall that gave Wall Street its name. The people who dug the streets and put up the buildings of the city that would later tell its history without them in it. Those people came from all over the African continent. Not just from a coast the slave ships sailed close to, but from inland, from the south, from the east, from places that the usual story of the slave trade had mostly left out. This is not a small correction. It is the difference between a story that says the ancestors of Black Americans came from one part of a continent and a story that says they came from a whole continent. It changes the shape of the African American family tree in ways that 300 years of written records were never able to show, because those records were never trying to show it in the first place. The records kept what was useful to the people writing them. The DNA kept what was true. There is something important to understand about why this discovery matters so much to this community, and about why it could only have happened the way it did. Genetic research on African and African American people has usually been done by researchers who were not part of those communities, for reasons that did not always help those communities, using explanations that did not always match what the communities already knew about their own history. The African Burial Ground Project was different from the very start, because the community made sure it would be. Howard University, Black scholars, Black researchers, people whose own ancestors might have been among those buried in that ground. Before we get to what the DNA found, it's worth understanding what the bones had already shown. The Howard team found that many of the people buried there had been born in Africa. They could tell this in the chemistry inside teeth, which records the minerals in the water and food a person ate as a child. Chemical signs from West Africa showed up in many samples, but so did signs that did not match the usual West African pattern. Signs pointing places further east, further south, and further inland than the known slave trade routes would have predicted. The bones were already complicating the story before a single strand of DNA had even been tested. They found signs of a population under enormous physical stress. Repeated strain injuries in the arms and shoulders of men who had been doing heavy manual labor from a young age. Ring-shaped marks on the skulls of women that only form after years of carrying weight on the head, a practice common across the African continent. Carried with them and continued in a city that never bothered to write it down. Children with growth problems in their bones, the biological sign of periods of severe hunger that interrupted normal growth, preserved in their skeletons for 300 years. These were real people. They had names that the people who captured them never bothered to keep. They had languages. They knew about farming and building and medicine that made them valuable to the colony they were forced to build. And they had origins that the records of that colony were never meant to preserve. Jackson's work on the ancient DNA from the burial soil carries that tradition forward. She is not an outside expert studying a subject from a distance. She is a black woman scientist at a black university, studying the DNA of black ancestors for the benefit of black descendants. The question she asked, not just where these people came from in a general sense, but how wide and complex the real origins of black Americans actually were, is a question that serves the community it comes from. It does not make the story simpler for outsiders. It makes the story more complicated, in ways that are truer to what actually happened. The answer to that question is still being put together. Jackson has been clear about the limits of what we know so far. Ancient DNA is fragile. It breaks down. It gets contaminated easily. Getting reliable results from material that has been in the ground for 300 years is slow and careful work. Every finding has to be checked and rechecked. This is science done carefully, not science rushed out for a headline. But the big finding, that the maternal family lines point not to one small part of Africa, but to the whole continent, is real, and it has effects that reach into the present in ways that feel personal, not just historical. What Jackson's work suggests is that what black Americans are looking for when they search for their African roots is far more complicated than anyone had been taught to expect. Not one country, not one ethnic group, not one coastline. The ancestors came from across the entire African continent, brought together in the holds of ships and in grounds like this burial site in Manhattan. And out of that came something new, a people with roots in more of Africa than the records ever admitted. That is not a smaller story. That is a much bigger one. None of this is finished. The questions Jackson is asking of the burial soil will take years to fully answer. The science of ancient DNA is moving faster now than ever before. The same methods are now being used on burial grounds and plantation cemeteries across the country, where enslaved people were buried without names. Every site that gets studied adds another piece to a picture that is still being put together. The soil is still there. The lab is still working. The questions the bones could not answer while still in the ground are now being asked of the DNA left behind in it. And every result that comes back is another name the records never kept. Another family line the records never followed. Another piece of something that was always there, waiting for someone to think to ask. When someone takes a DNA test today, hoping to find out whether their family came from Senegal or Ghana or Nigeria or somewhere their records have never named, they're using a chain of knowledge that runs straight through this ground. The burial ground is a national monument now. Tourists visit. School groups come. The memorial stands. But underneath the street beside it, under the ground where those coffins were returned in 2003, the story is not finished. It is being read for the first time, piece by piece, from material that survived everything the city built on top of it. The community broke open the ground. And what the DNA is saying, slowly and carefully, to the people who finally thought to listen, is that the ancestors did not come from one place. They came from everywhere. And that changes everything about who their descendants are allowed to know themselves to be.